Aloha and welcome to the 21st installment of the Pythagorean Order of Death podcast, or the POD podcast. I, as always, am your host, Reverend Jonathan Barlow G. And this 21st installment of the podcast is going to be the 12th installment of an Ask Me Anything session between myself and someone who's submitted questions. In this case, it's the second such submission by Austin R. AR, who's growing to be a good friend of the brand and of the podcast itself. So this will be the second with him, and the 12th overall of Ask Me Anythings, and the 21st episode of the podcast in total. So this will be a reading of an interview between he and I. And without any further ado, as always, let's dive right in. Austin's first question: what is change? Socrates described it as the body changes, such as a person getting older, and mentions the soul never changes when a baby is born. Change is the external symptom of the otherwise invisible force of time. In physics, change is motion. Without motion or change of any kind, there would be no way to measure the difference between one moment or event in time and any other. Therefore, the passage of time from one moment to the next is measured as changes and motions of the elements comprising reality. This effect appears digital, with some pixels or parts appearing to change while others do not, as opposed to being analog, where everything would change all at once, like the individual photographs flashing from one frame to the next along a strip of movie film. This apparent discrepancy in the rate of time occurs because change happens faster on smaller size scales and slower on larger scales. Einstein and the contemporary Kybalion both stress the premise that microscopic particles move very fast and that the visible heavenly bodies move much slower by comparison, but that the same movement defines them both over long enough timeline. Thus, the same forces that determine the behavior of an atom also determine the behavior of planets and stars. Of all the universal elemental forces known currently, the commonality connecting them all is called, nowadays, spin. Thus, spin affects the known quanta of fusion, fission, and electromagnetism, as well as the yet theoretical graviton quantum, which I hypothesize to be faster than light tachyons. Likewise, spin obviously occurs in the visible heavens, for moons revolving around planets, for planets rotating and revolving around stars, for the differential rotation of the EM fields of stars, and for spiral galaxies formed from stars revolving inward toward a core black hole. So, in modern theoretical astrophysics and quantum mechanics, spin is considered the unifying substance connecting the micro quantum scale to the macro astronomical scale, and the definitive trait of all matter energy. However, even Pythagoras recognized what moderns call chirality in spin, or so-called left and right-handedness, according to whether the spin is clockwise or counterclockwise, which led to the ridiculous conclusion by the first philosopher that all atoms of the four elements were equally balanced between spin and counterspin. It is indeed the case that all real spin possesses its opposite counterspin in potential, but this hardly plays out as balance among all the spinning objects in the cosmos today. For example, there is obviously not an equal amount of matter, called bosons, and energy, called fermions, in the visible universe now, although theoretically this condition may have been possible at a certain point of critical mass in our universe's distant past. Of course, it is also obvious that spin is not the sole and only manifestation of change in the cosmos. In fact, it is spontaneous symmetry breaking events that occur when a particle spinning one direction begins spinning in another that constitute entropy, and it is entropy by which we measure the totality of change over time, to such an extent that, in physics, time and entropy are synonymous concepts. In short, in reality, everything is always in motion, and mostly this motion constitutes spin, but as matter decays into energy, it adds the element of entropy to motion to describe all change over time. So, on the atomic and cosmic scales, it is this universal force of change over time, or simply time itself, that causes aging in the living and decaying of the dead. I disagree, though, that the soul is unchanging, as it supposedly stores our memories, and these are always being added to, so long as we're alive at least. God in monotheism is certainly not unchanging either, although often called the unmoved mover. His moods remain fickle and his motives ephemeral. How do East and West philosophies compare to one another? Before there was ever the idea of a one true God, there was polytheism, the belief in a multitude of gods. This evolved into the idea of the pantheon, or a group of ruling deities who controlled and commanded all the rest. As science progressed, such as it was, the few gods, describing more universal traits or elements, came to rule over the many gods, describing the local, regional, or national deities who stood as symbols for the first city-state empires. However, ultimately, this situation was reversed in an event called the Titanomachy, or War in Heaven. In the era of the earliest Babylonian Empire in the Levant, the national gods came to supplant in importance the elder elemental deities. From this event came the rise of monotheism, as Abraham left Ur in direct protest against Babylon's national god, Marduk, and established Enlil, the elemental god of the sky and nominally Marduk's uncle, as his Elohim, or chosen deity. Until this point, note, all the populated lands of Earth had shared the same basic belief in a pantheon of plural deities, some local, most elemental, who all more or less shared power over the fates and fortunes of all mankind together. Then, around 500 BC in the Orient, Buddha was born, and in the Occident, Pythagoras was born. While both shared the long-established belief in reincarnation of the soul, Buddha's teachings dwelt mostly on ethics and his eightfold path leading to enlightenment as transcendence from life's suffering. But Pythagoras, called the first philosopher in the West, began the study of number and music theories and started the trend of examining maths and sciences recreationally. In many respects, the values of Buddhism did not enter the Levant until the teachings of Jesus in the Sermon on the Mount were canonized in the Latin Vulgate New Testament Gospels. While claimed to be the son of the monotheist God of Abraham, Jesus taught essentially identical moral values to Buddha some 500 years later. But rather than founding a successful school for thousands of students, as Buddha did, Jesus' efforts were, supposedly, met with his torture and crucifixion. It remains an interesting historical footnote to ponder if the ethical teachings of Jesus would have been more acceptable to a predominantly polytheist audience, as were Buddha's, and if Jesus' teachings did not fall on deaf ears, as it were, solely due to the region's monotheism. While Buddhism spread across India, excuse me, while Buddhism spread across Asia, the Catholic papacy struggled to find a way to enforce Christ's golden rule. The confusion and irony of monotheism had already polluted Jesus' teachings to such an extent that, prior to the discovery of the Americas by Europeans, Judeo-Christian values had come to be synonymous with the Inquisition. Perhaps for this reason, China had become xenophobic and erected a massive wall to separate themselves from Western influence. It was not until Christendom had fully manifested its destiny with westward expansion that the ideas of Buddhism were again infused into Western civilization. It was even only as recently as the early 20th century that many of Buddha's teachings became available in English translation for the first time. This, coupled with the rediscovery of the Essene Qumran scrolls and the Gnostic Nag Hammadi library codices, has led to the theosophical syncretism of modern globalist religions into, effectively, monism, the belief in a one true God that is purported to be common to all theisms of any kind. What are your own ideas/inspiration for manifesting a better future for humanity? At this exact moment in history, there are, simultaneously, a movement among the rich elites for a one-world government, and an opposition movement to this that favors grassroots populism, idealized libertarian anarchism, and practical sovereign nationalism. A one-world government is not a new idea. Long before even the League of Nations, precursor to the modern UN, there was the Delian League of 478 BC, uniting the Attica Peninsula, spearheaded by Athens and Sparta. The idea of a single world-unifying government or culture has been the stated expression for their motivation by every empire from the era of Babylon and Alexander the Great until the rise of multicultural socialism and the militarization of American exceptionalism today. It has been said, wrongly I believe, you can please some of the people some of the time, but you can't please everyone always. My contribution in the POD material is meant as a compromise between globalism and anarchism, satisfactory to both. Stated in brief, the idea is government for those who would govern, freedom for the rest of us. Although the layout for Atlantean democracy, as put forth in the POD materials, is short for a governmental constitution, it expresses the simplest rules for participation in this sort of a society. The format for the government itself is, as I often say, based on ideal number theory, with a Senate of 23, including 7 presidents or chief executives, and from which a 13-member jury may be drawn by lot. All odd number groups ensures no tie votes. This would then be the sole seat of government in the whole world. All citizens would be free to do as they want otherwise. The daily doings of this government in name only would be broadcast on a global telecommunications system so that everyone could tune in optionally. The Atlantean senators then would be tasked to solve social problems on a global scale as philosopher kings, but their rulings would not have the weight of an army behind them. So obeying their laws would be, again, optional as well. The question then is often posed of such a system. How do you prevent people from committing crimes en masse? How do you prevent people from forming their own armies and becoming petty warlords? In such a society, it would likely be necessary to pair the Atlantean democracy format of government with a parallel economic system I call the Lemurian Church Bank, that would serve as a voluntary system granting one registered access to free energy and wireless electricity via a network of Tesla towers. Of course, anyone could make use of these towers without needing to check in at the bank, but doing so protects their use of this system with a direct record of such. Thus, anyone who commits a crime could, using this system, be tracked as either a registered user or as someone off the grid, and so brought more swiftly to justice. Because this wireless electrical network would be available to everyone, it would be up to the people to police its use for themselves. The small Atlantean global government would not be able to provide this service for the population, so the population would have to protect themselves and one another from crime and fraud. The only nagging problem that remains with this all is, how do you enforce a law that makes armies illegal if you do not have an army to enforce this law? This apparent paradox persists to plague the POD's underlying philosophy. But aside from this, the system appears entirely potentially beneficial. So this is my idea for a utopian future that people can manifest as an alternative to the many more dystopian models around nowadays. What is considered a dangerous genius person? Relatively intelligent people who are considered dangerous or evil geniuses are usually serial killers or rapists who have learned to camouflage themselves to move amongst people, civilized people, without revealing their crimes to public disapproval. This takes a level of practice that is considered genius among those who study the criminal mind. However, the actual IQ of these sort of criminals is usually lower than that of the police and lawyers who catch and prosecute them. Even the intellects of these police and lawyers is usually only average, or only a little bit above it, at around 100 to 120 IQ points. It doesn't take much intellect to be a police detective, and even less to be a public defender. So none of these people should truly be considered geniuses, even when they are called so by one another. It has been my experience the majority of cops are corrupt, and fall into one of two categorical types. One, police who are lazy and plead incompetence, and two, police who join the force only to be legally sanctioned, to bully innocent people, and to break laws they would otherwise have to obey. A small percentage of good cops exist, but they are usually rookies and quit before becoming corrupt. There are more corrupt cops than there are genius criminals, and it is because of this many genius criminals are allowed to function in society with lack of ultimate legal culpability. The truly genius criminals are the politicians and soldiers who govern armies. They order mass murder and escape all just ramifications due such war crimes. Even these people have relatively low IQs, usually not much greater than 120 to 130. The world is run by midwits, and those with actual genius level IQs are usually focused on some specialization or other that preoccupies them from caring about the world outside of their scope. This is, in itself, a form of systemic criminality as well, that those who are most apt and fit to rule the world should be consigned to sit aside while the fate of the world is decided by people with, literally, barely more than half their capacity for intelligence. People with IQs of 130 to 140 are not usually evil, but are still seen as being the most potentially dangerous by the rest, simply because the majority are deeply distrustful of intellect generally. As I've often joked, in truth, half of all humanity rightly thinks the other half are crazy, and the crazy half rightly thinks the other half are fools. It's been my experience personally that there is no such thing as a safe and trustworthy human being. Everyone of every level of IQ, from Down syndrome to Einstein, is capable to some extent of doing great evil, and everyone is only as moral as their options. How does Aristotle's and Plato's work compare? In his opus, The Republic, Plato describes the five regimes he learned of from his teacher Socrates before Socrates had been put to death by the state. It is likely these five regimes of government were intended, from a time even prior to Socrates, to correspond not only to the five parts of the soul, as Plato elaborates in Socrates' name, but also to the five so-called Platonic solids. This system, correlating fire to the tetrahedron, earth to the cube, water to the octahedron, air to the isosahedron, and cosmos to the dodecahedron, was meant to underlie the curriculum instructed at Plato's Academy. But it is clear from his student Aristotle's own writings on metaphysics that the cohesiveness of this system was lost on the younger generations more and more with each that passed. Technically, this system is the basis for the POD work I've compiled, but the assignation of the elements to the Platonic solids is rearranged in mine. The tetrahedron is cosmos, the octahedron fire, the isosahedron water, the cube, still earth, and the dodecahedron air. The difference between the system described by the Greeks and that described in the POD is due to the degradation of the Greek system from its original version derived by Pythagoras and kept by him occult and, allegedly, only ever explained orally. Subsequently, the sophist elementalists taught independently all is water, Thales, all is air, Anaximenes, all is fire, Heraclitus, all is atoms, Democritus, or all is mind, Anaxagoras, but disagreed with one another that these elements all necessarily combined to form the unique recipe for nature in reality. Aristotle grasped at this ideal, but the right proper assignation of the elements to the solids had already, by then, been lost. What are your thoughts on finding small, like baby universes, such as by radio surfing or channel surfing on YouTube, and how can they be experimented with? As you may be aware from my music remixes that I've uploaded here on YouTube and elsewhere, I have a unique sense of taste in what constitutes music to my ears. I personally enjoy a genre that most likely would find annoying and overstimulating, that is, mashup music, or remixes combining two or more songs into a single track. In the tamest versions of this, one can sample the vocals from one popular song and the instrumental audio from another, and then combine these in a humorous way. More complex mixes of this style are essentially the same as mixing instrumental audio with samples from a speech or movie dialogue track, and can be manipulated the same ways, usually using simple repeating of phrases on beat. So this is mashup, as far as the average modern YouTube historian is concerned. They are content to ignore and censor my personal favorite style of the mashup genre, simply mixing one song with another at equal volume to one another with no other edits. One can even play one song in one stereo channel and the other in the other, but this is an experimental application of the mashup remixing method, and so not considered appropriate by copyright censor bots and YouTube's community guidelines moderators. It is perhaps reasoned it is lazy as far as remixing goes, but more importantly, it is simply considered noise. This, indeed, is what makes it appealing to me. It is a field of noise inside of which the brain struggles to seek for signal by assembling a new song, combining those in the remix. The result is usually either sludge, where the original song is pitch shifted down like chipmunks on 16 speed, or else sensory overload, where two or more musical songs are combined to form one new track that can feature multiple different keys, tempos, and beats, all playing simultaneously to one another. Some call it cacophony. I call it God. I listen to my remixes while I drive and while I write. I was listening to them just as I was writing this to help me concentrate as I composed these words. I taught myself audio mixing exclusively to make this type of mashup track, and not so that I could compose new music using digital instruments. I find its overstimulation comforting. I learned this a long time ago. First, by listening to the dead channels on the radio between the live stations. I used to imagine that in this vague in-between realm on the radio dial, I could pick up on cosmic radio waves and the effects of solar flares. Later, I played the radio and the television at the same time and found the cross-fading of information from one source to the other to make a pleasant mental diversion, whereby I could then focus my forebrain on other tasks like writing or art. So for me, this sort of music is genuinely inspirational, and I still have a strong belief that one can receive spontaneous new ideas from this method of sensory stimuli. The internet makes it ridiculously easy to perform such audio experiments, to determine what suits one's own tastes, best in this genre, if any at all. If you want to hear what this sort of music sounds like, just press play on any two songs at the same time. I would not classify the rabbit holes this can lead one down as baby universes exactly, though this genre does skirt the border between schizophrenia and logical, sane, rational realism. It is like the soundtrack for a vacation into madness, but I happen to enjoy it. Maybe someone listening now does too. Could cryptocurrency replace paper money? Cryptocurrency will eventually replace paper money, but this can come about in only one of two ways: rapidly and violently, in which case the result will be cheap and perverse, or else gradually and voluntarily, in which case the result will be beneficial for everyone. In the former case, if cash were outlawed and crypto became the enforced social currency, it would require a sufficient amount of the population to be able to use crypto easier than cash. Otherwise, the economy would collapse as it would exclude the majority or working class proles. To accomplish this in short order would require the mass RFID tagging of the populace in a campaign neither voluntary nor humane, such that crypto could be exchanged in a manner easier than even cash or credit cards, that is, via subcutaneous implant chip. Again, this method of implementation for such a currency would be catastrophic to the confidence necessary to bolster a fiscally fluid global economy, and could only be accomplished by a vast and nefarious conspiracy. On the other hand, if crypto remains, as it has been, rolled out relatively slowly as a competing currency, it will be allowed to prove its worth alongside the value of paper cash and credit-backed banking systems, and thus come to be adopted, or not, only on its own best merits. This will mean that the anonymity per transaction and the preservation of a blockchain encrypted receipt will likely be maintained even into future iterations of crypto, such as will become possible in the near future with quantum computers. What are your own metaphysics theories for someone to find in books? Most of my metaphysics theories can be found in my 2003 book, The Metaphysician's Desk Reference, or MPDR for short, currently still available on Amazon.com from its original print-on-demand publisher, Author House, formerly called First Books. One of my metaphysical theories is that the four terrestrial elements can be corresponded to the four universal elemental forces, such that water equals gravity, electromagnetism equals air, weak nuclear fission equals fire, and strong nuclear fission equals earth, and that the three alchemical elements correspond to the three phases of matter. Salt equals solid, mercury equals liquid, sulfur equals gaseous. This is a theory that may be prevalent by now, but which I learned from no one else besides my own reading and intuition. Another such theory I surmised before learning its proper nomenclature was panspermia as it relates to abiogenesis. My metaphysical theory about the first life on Earth has long been that an alien virus crash landed onto Earth on a meteor or asteroid and began to assemble the local elements from the earliest complex carbohydrate macromolecules. This alien virus then evolved as RNA alongside the DNA it had created from these indigenous ingredients, and has since bred itself to become all species of life on Earth today as hybrids combining inert, bacteria-like tissues with an animating, sentient bacteriophage. The template of this earliest virus, with pincers, a gut tube, and a head, can still be seen in the roots, trunks, and branches of trees, and the nerves, spines, and brains of animals. But my most unique personal metaphysical theory is that the force-carrying quantum of gravity is not the theoretical graviton, but the also theoretical subquantum in size scale, faster than light in velocity, tachyon, and that the gravitational field proposed by Einstein results from a hyperspace of such tachyons that supersedes the local universe and is pulling on space-time from outside of it like a riptide before a wave front. I've since learned also about the black hole cosmology model, which I agree is likely true. The local universe is a baby universe inside the gravitational singularity of a larger cosmic scale black hole, with the difference between the singularity at the core of this black hole and the event horizon circumference surrounding it being filled by this hyperspace of tachyons. The argument I make for tachyons carrying gravity within the local universe is that gravity appears uniquely and exclusively attractive, unlike fusion, fission, and EM, which all carry a repulsive force. Only because its particulate a component, tachyons, move backwards in time, so that their naturally repulsive force appears to us to be attractive in reverse. Again, all these theories are discussed in depth in my 2003 book, The Metaphysician's Desk Reference. Can gold be used for currency? Gold has reliably been used for currency on and off throughout nearly the entirety of human history. The first gold coins were minted in the Koine Greek dialect era, hence, I would guess, the name we still use today for the specie circular, or third-party token of exchange. The first form of money was as cowrie shells, and these and gold had both been used in ornamental jewelry long prior to the invention of the metal coin in the Iron Age Indus Valley culture of the Indian subcontinent. Long after this, the first gold coin minted was called the drachma, and worth its weight in a certain amount of barley or grains or what have you. The metal coin came to prevail over the Sumero-Babylonian cylinder seal IOU slips printed on papyrus used to signify a certain weight of barley or grain, etc., held in reserve in a community silo by the Sumerian equivalent of a modern central bank. It was quickly proved such paper banknotes could easily be forged or stolen, or their originals destroyed, leaving one powerless, in any event, to recoup their losses, ensuring most fell into indentured servitude to the theocracy. Gold was difficult to dilute in value, and only by metallurgic mixing could its weight and purity be seemingly replicated in a yet faulty specimen. Most importantly, gold, besides in jewelry, had no other purpose or use value than to function as a form of token exchange. Every time any other method has been tried, the economy has eventually collapsed and reverted back to gold coins. The present experiment, with a global network of central banks being autonomous lenders of essentially counterfeit value, to individual national governments has led, at least in the USA, to a national debt that has been greater than the annual national gross domestic product since the big bank bailout of 2008. The result of the US dollar being in a condition of quantitative easing, a euphemism for hyperinflation, leveraged by the US Federal Reserve, privately owned central bank, is a negative effect on the entire global economy because the USD is the world reserve currency, or translational value for trade of all other forms of stocks and bonds internationally. Ultimately, the US dollar cannot be both, and so it will likely collapse eventually and revert to a mixed basket economy of competing currencies that will include both crypto and gold coins. The only real question is there enough gold already mined to allow gold coins to replace the USD IOU note as the world reserve currency? The answer to that is likely no, but gold coins could very easily become the currency du jour once again on a national or regional scale. Ideally, such a transition would not need to involve a violent economic crash. Are Plato's and Aristotle's philosophy wrapped up in religion and paganism? The earliest centuries of the AD era have come to be known as the Dark Ages of Europe due to the short life expectancy of serfs, the generally illiterate and uneducated status of most citizens, and a lingering confusion in religious identity, having only recently gone from being a province of the Roman Empire to being a subject to the Catholic papacy instead. As a result, one generation had been largely nomadic Celtic Gauls, and within as few as a half dozen generations later, their descendants would find themselves toiling as farmers and paying heavy taxes to a foreign monarch and steep tithes to an alien church. During this period, the arts of reading and writing were nearly lost among the masses in what constituted the whole of Christendom. It was only through the creation of monastic orders, where priests and probationers would dwell, cloistered away from the world in monasteries, and attempt to preserve an austere and serene lifestyle, that these sacred knowledges were maintained throughout this time. Reading and writing became holy tasks, kept among only the most wise few, and practiced through the fine art of illuminated manuscripts. However, aside from solely scriptural texts, these scribes were also tasked with transcribing copies of texts yet preserved from the ancient world, which we now call the BC era. These works included the works of Plato and Aristotle that the church sanctioned, but also others, such as certain early church fathers who'd been deemed heretical, as well as other ancient authors the papacy considered to have been anti-Christian cults prior to the lifetime of Jesus, such as the works of the school of Pythagoras. Many ancient tomes were lost during this period, but those that were preserved were copiously mass reproduced by hand for the private collections of wealthy aristocrats who could hire private tutors to use these books to instruct their children. The works were usually preserved in their original languages, and so learning to read and write multilingually, usually in Latin and Greek, French, German, and English, was considered an essential aspect of a young aristocrat's education. So, long before the printing press, there were scribal monks. Among the eldest and wisest of them were the few philosophers of the early Christian era, such as St. Augustine of Hippo, 354 until 430 AD, author of City of God, St. Francis of Assisi, 1181 until 1226 AD, the monk who communed empathically with all kinds of animals, and ultimately St. Thomas Aquinas, 1225 until 1274, whose Thomism philosophy attempted to synthesize Aristotelian philosophy with the Trinitarian principles of Catholicism. These saints were all Christian apologists, but also Neoplatonists, who covertly ushered the ancient world's texts we know of yet today through one of the darkest times of Western civilization's history and directly under the noses of church censors. Why hasn't there been any research on the psychological damage that magic can cause? There has been, and quite a lot. Most of it is published in true crime accounts, but usually overlooked as being unrelated from one case to another, which it is not. In almost all individual cases of serial killers, organized pedophile rings, lone assassins, themselves usually activated sleeper agents of PSYOP mind control programming, and charismatic cult leaders, there is the mention, often obliquely, other times outright, of certain practices called by the criminals themselves ritual magic, usually in group settings. The most famous such case probably remains the Manson family, cult of LSD brainwashed hippie murderers of 1969, although the case of Jim Jones, who had his followers drink poison Kool-Aid to commit mass suicide in 1978, is another fine example. After all, from whom did these cults acquire their drugs? Since these cases, the Satanic Panic occurred in the 1980s, although aside from the organization remembered now as the Finders, very little headway was made in solving the rampant allegations of so-called satanic ritual abuse of children at that time. Following this, from the mid-90s until 2019, wealthy financial advisor Jeffrey Epstein ran a massive international child sex trafficking ring in plain sight of countless police agencies, demonstrating the concerns that cops may be complicit in covering up such an immense and heinous crime. On Epstein's personal island, there was an enormous sundial surrounded by benches, presumably for the practice of some sort of superstitious ceremony. The question of what happens to missing children is unbelievably shocking. Most end up being trafficked for sex, hooked on drugs by organized handlers, and prostituted in trap houses until finally being tortured and killed on snuff films, with their organs harvested and sold on the international black market. All of this reeks of pure evil from a westernized, puritanical point of view, and surely the giant owl statue symbolizing Minerva in Bohemian Grove does not help the rich elites implicated in such foul play out from under accusations of Molech worship and modern-day human sacrifice. Of course, there may seem to have been no real scholarly works assembling a complete data set, cross-referencing all these themes with the actual practice of ritual magic, but, as I say, it is mentioned independently in almost all these sort of cases, without any further conclusion being drawn. The case investigating the Finders, for example, was shut down as an internal matter by the U.S. CIA. It stands to reason there is not a more thorough record and account of satanic ritual abuse cults involving magic, because these tactics likely continue to be employed in the field of domestic and foreign spycraft to this very day. How does reason work with deep analogy? Good, sound, logical reasoning does not need to involve analogy or hyperbole at all. These practices are almost always engaged in when a more intelligent person is trying to communicate a complex idea to another less intelligent person or people. Then their language becomes stilted and pedantic, and they begin to take on the affectation of condescendingly reciting a nursery rhyme to a simplistic child. For example, in the New Testament Gospels descriptions of Jesus' sermons, he spoke to crowds using parables, or short fables with implied moral lessons. This parabolic or hyperbolic form of self-expression is divorced from the logical reasoning that motivates it by the idiocy of the masses, an effect demonstrable by the simple observation that people in large crowds are far more likely to behave antisocially, aggressively, and even violently than they would be as individuals alone. One's personal, ethical inhibitions are lost in a crowd, and so one is more prone to groupthink and going along with the herd, even when they can see the herd is stampeding off a cliff. Comparing crowds of people to domesticated beasts of burden is itself merely an analogy, and not exactly logically accurate either. In your research, how do you define what it is and what is it not? Quid est veritas, as Pontius Pilate allegedly asked Jesus, is Latin for what is truth. How does one know what is true as apart from what is false? How does one know right as apart from wrong? It has been my personal experience in life that a surprising number of people are merely adrift in a moral morass, lost in a gray fog of rationalization and equivocation to justify their egotistical actions ex post facto. Such people find ethics alienated and mysterious, and moreover uninviting compared to the apparently alternative option of plunging headlong off the deep end into an abyssal miasma of despair. I have never found it particularly difficult to know right from wrong and good from evil, although I have not always intentionally sided with what is largely believed to be the right and better choice. There are many evil liars in this world who only exist to prey on innocence and pervert justice. It is always unwise to trust such people, though they often play the victim to lure in kind-hearted souls, like a spider will a fly, and once one becomes entangled with them, it becomes increasingly difficult to extricate themselves from this increasingly worsening predicament. Truths, even frightening truths, ought not be kept from children. It does not diminish one's own innocence to understand the threat posed by other members of your species. Not everyone is a special flower. Many people are but compost at best. As I say, I have never had trouble identifying good people as apart from evil people. I simply have too often gravitated toward the evil people in an attempt to punish and sabotage myself. My personality being, thus, a magnet for assholes, I've grown quite bitter and thick-skinned over the decades, but my cynicism is only a well-learned armor to divide my inner self as apart from everyone else. In my innermost soul, I continue to know what is truth, good, and right, and that they are in contrast to all that I've endured. Perhaps it is the soul itself that serves as one's moral compass, for those without one are certainly lost. The philosophical idea on alchemy, from silver to gold. The great work of traditional alchemy describes a series of four color-coded stages: the black phase, the white phase, the yellow phase, and finally, the red phase. These colors, it should be noted, constitute the hues associated with the Sephiroth Malkuth, the kingdom, following the early 1900s designs of the Golden Dawn, as well as having seemingly inspired Madame Blavatsky's so-called root races in her 1888 work Anthropogenesis. Despite these dubious later associations, the great work itself had been studied by Paracelsus, 1493 until 1541, who'd conceptualized creating a genetic homunculus using only the rudimentary chemistry knowledge of his era, and Heinrich Cornelius Agrippa, 1486 until 1535, who'd identified six different phases in the alchemical transformative process as a result of pairing each of the four terrestrial elements to every other once, and then subtracting all the pairs containing the same element twice. By the era of Dr. John Dee, 1527 until 1609, who'd integrated elements of alchemy, such as finding buried treasure, into his Enochian works, likely on the suggestion of his cohort and scryer Edward Kelly, a renowned con man and failed alchemist himself. The general interest in and understanding of alchemy had already begun to fade. Nevertheless, the resurgence by Dee's fellow Rosicrucian and contemporary Heinrich Kuhnrath, 1560 until 1605, with his work Amphitheater of Eternal Wisdom, including as its first stage the Alchemist's Laboratory print, during the late Renaissance era, likely inspired Sir Isaac Newton, 1642 until 1727, around a century later, during the early Enlightenment era, to preside over what, by 1660, had come to be called the Royal Society, the first group devoted exclusively to the study of materialist science. By the modern era, and the Red Book of Carl Jung, 1875 until 1961, the great work of alchemy has been interpreted as purely psychological symbolisms. What is being human? What is being in human nature? Being, or existing, in the context of human nature, is most commonly defined as suffering. This is because our brains feel through our nervous systems, and this is contained within our soft tissue. Thus, when our soft tissue contacts any tactile element in the surrounding environment outside ourselves, our interior nerves feel it and send the message accordingly to our brain. Over time, as our bodies age, the electrochemical transduction of sensory stimuli across our nervous systems begins to cause inflammation to our soft tissues, and this slight swelling presses in on our nerves, resulting in chronic fatigue, immune deficiency, and depression, such as the process of aging, experienced as physical aches and pains by the body itself. And this sets a baseline of suffering, pain, and sorrow for the majority of one's lifetime. Thus, the experience of physical existence itself appears to be perceived by the mind, inhabiting the brain and informed by the nerves, as lifelong pain and suffering. Buddha described this suffering, or dukkha, as samsara and likened it to the elder Vedic Hindu concept of Maya, or illusion. His reasoning was that, as change causes suffering, change itself is only temporary, and as such is merely an illusory veil concealing the permanent, unchanging, clear light of nirvana, wherein there is eternal peace, calm, and bliss, the antithesis of worldly suffering. In the Buddhist sutras, dukkha was defined in three main parts. One, distress due to what is not desirable, and aversion to the physical pangs of samsara, as the cycle of birth, aging, illness, and dying that perpetually repeats in reincarnation and amnesia from one life to the next. Two, frustration over fading happiness and the mental separation from what is loved and desired by oneself. Three, the dissatisfaction with impermanent and ever-changing objects in material reality, and the feeling of emptiness associated with disappointment in all such trends. These three elements of dukkha also include, in Theravada Buddhism, clinging to the five heaps, these being 1, form, 2, sensation, 3, perception, 4, memory, and 5, discernment. These heaps constitute attachments to the flow of our mental processes, leading to the false association of our own ego, soul, or central self-concept with these processes themselves. Dukkha is often described as the presence of what is unpleasant and the absence of what is desired. The concept in Vedic Hindu Buddhism and in modern Western monotheisms of hell, or an underworld, as a place of perpetual suffering and despair, where one is plagued by demons and their immortal soul tortured ad infinitum, is a rare element shared by both Eastern and Western cosmologies. According to the modern existentialist philosophers, there are only being and time, as in the title of the 1927 opus by Martin Heidegger, 1889 until 1976, or else being and nothingness, the title of the 1943 opus by Jean-Paul Sartre, 1905 until 1980. In both these works, the authors lament the bleakness of life's sentient existence in the face of a world that seemingly causes mostly sorrow, pain, and ultimately death. To avoid fear of death, remember, pain is an illusion. So that draws to a close this 21st episode of the Pythagorean Order of Death podcast, or the POD podcast, and the 12th Ask Me Anything installment of the POD podcast, and the second by Austin R. uh, new friend of the brand and the um, podcast, and an excellent contributor of excellent questions. Thank you very much to Austin R. And thank you to all you who tune in to listen and to watch these videos. I'm very pleased and blessed to know that there are people out there that are willing to share my ideas with me, and to share questions and ask questions and answers of the ideas that I've had. So thank you very much again, just for being in the audience, whoever you may be. I hope that I've inspired and made you think a little bit. Um, that's the best I can do, is aspire to inspire. So with that, I guess I'll wrap it up and just say until next time, have a good one, and peace.